Hello, this is Matthew here from Nations of Sanity doing vlog number 4. And just to recap the first 3 videos I've done, in the first video I just gave a brief introduction to the Nations of Sanity and our basic idea, which is to create a free society by establishing the non-aggression principle as the universal law through a peace agreement. And in the second video, I went into a little bit more detail about this peace agreement, basically describing it as a 3-part agreement. Part 1 being the basic agreement, just to make the non-aggression principle the law. Part 2 is what I call the lines in the sand, where we set limits of tolerance over differing interpretations. And Part 3 is about agreeing rightful ownership, and that's basically where we ratify rightful ownership using the non-aggression principle. Now, in the second video, I went into mainly about part 2 and why it's so important that we set these limits of tolerance over differing interpretations so that people can't exploit the fuzzy edges and push differing interpretations into absurdities. We understand that there's a grey area in certain areas, but there's also a black and white that needs to be defined and separated from those grey areas. And then in the third video, I went into more detail about the concept of rightful ownership and how we define rightful ownership, which is basically, you rightfully own property that you create or acquire through voluntary trade. Anyone who's not seen any of those 3 videos, I recommend that you check them out so you know what I'm talking about. And in this video, I want to talk about voluntary collectives and the concept of voluntary collectives and why this is an important thing to understand as well. Basically, in a free society where the non-aggression principle is the law, ruling governments would be illegal. Ruling people involves threatening force and it's non-defensive, so it's a clear violation of the non-aggression principle. But what I try to get people to understand is that just because you can't have ruling governments, that doesn't mean that you can't have something that basically represents the same infrastructure and services that we associate with government, just without the coercion and the rights violating and the violating of basic freedom. And it's my contention that this would kind of no longer be government because, I say ruling governments, but governments are pretty much defined as ruling entities. So if you strip away the power to rule and violate people, then you're not really left with something that's probably accurately described as a government. So I think that probably the most appropriate term for such an entity would be voluntary collective. So when I talk about voluntary collectives, I'm talking about any kind of collective or organisation that's non-coercive, that's in line with the non-aggression principle, that doesn't violate anybody's rights, doesn't wield any power to rule over anybody or anything like that. Now, generally speaking, I kind of present this mainly as to talk about what governments would turn into. So if we had a revolution tomorrow under the Nations of Sanity, the next day, everything could look pretty much the same as it does today. Everything could carry on as it does, and what was once government could continue to function with regards to the infrastructure and the services and even the alleged democratic representation. But what they would lose would be the power to coerce, the power to violate rights, and the power to rule over people. So such an organisation would automatically convert into a voluntary collective. And the reason why this is important is because a lot of people seem to think that if you don't have a ruling government, then you can't have any of the things that they associate with ruling governments. And I'm not just talking about things like roads and stuff. I'm talking about, for example, law enforcement. So like you can still have a police force in a voluntary society that enforces the non-aggression principle. Such an organisation, though, would also have to obey the non-aggression principle. In our current society, police have extra powers and extra rights that normal citizens don't have. They need these extra powers and rights to enforce a lot of the laws that currently exist, because a lot of the laws that currently exist involve initiating force against peaceful people and basically violating rights and freedoms, which is a power that most people don't have and shouldn't have. But we have to give these powers to our police forces for them to be able to enforce immoral laws. Now, in a free society, there'd be no immoral laws. All the laws would be the non-aggression principle, which means that all the laws, enforcing all of the laws, would only involve defensive force. So, in a free society, everybody has the right to enforce the non-aggression principle. but not everybody necessarily has the ability. If you have some little old lady, technically she has the right to use force against someone trying to mug her, but that doesn't mean that she's necessarily got the ability to, to defend herself. So there's nothing wrong with having organisations that enforce the non-aggression principle on behalf of people that can't defend themselves. But what we need to understand is that to do that, you don't also need the power to violate rights. You don't also need to have the power to rule over people. So, as I say, this is a very important point. In my next video, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about voluntary collectives. For example, how they can be funded through non-coercive means, basically voluntary alternatives to taxation and such. But in this video, I just wanted to introduce the concept of voluntary collectives and the basic idea that voluntary collectives can replace governments. If we establish the non-aggression principle as law tomorrow, basically all governments would have to immediately convert into voluntary collectives. And what that basically means is they can run as they do now, except you remove all the coercion. You remove all of the power to violate people, all the power to rule over people. And what you're left with is only an organisation that provides infrastructure, services, perhaps democratic representation if that's what people want. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't have the power to make extra laws that violate the existing laws. The only law is the non-aggression principle. There's no person that rules over people. There is just this principle. And this principle, as I said in my previous videos, is based on the concept that everyone has right over their own self. It's what we call self-ownership. You have right over your own self, your own body, your own consciousness, your thoughts and your actions are your thoughts and actions, and you have the right to decide what you do with your life. And as long as you're not violating anybody else's rights, you should have the right to do that. So when it comes to voluntary collectives, we can have a voluntary collective. We can have something that operates much like government, except it doesn't violate rights, it doesn't rule over people, it doesn't infringe on basic freedom, it only exists to protect rights. And it doesn't have to only exist to protect rights. It can exist for other purposes. It can provide democratic representation. It can provide welfare and healthcare. We can do all of these things collectively, as long as we're not violating anyone's rights, as long as we're not forcing people to participate in things they don't want to be involved in, as long as everything is voluntary and compliant with the non-aggression principle, then that's how things can carry on. So the reason why this is important to understand is a lot of people think of anarchy or anarchism, and they think of removing ruling governments, and they just think of total chaos. They think of lawlessness. They think of all of these terrible things. And what they need to understand is that doesn't need to be the case. We can have everything we have right now, but just take the coercion away. We can have a police force that can, enforce laws against rape, murder and theft and assault and all of that and protect people's rights, but they don't get to enforce drug laws and gambling laws or even prostitution laws or any law that infringes on people's basic rights. So I hope I've been clear in this video, and as I say, in my next video I'll go in a little bit more detail about how we can fund such organisations through non-coercive methods. Thank you.